It is the people who ask questions that actually control a conversation, not the people who give answers. Our normal tendency is to think otherwise, that those who have the answers are in charge of a conversation. But actually it's the other way around that is true. And it isn't just a gimmick or just something that happened in a French class many years ago in a high school in India. Somebody once counted, I've never checked it independently, that there are at least 153 questions that Jesus asked. And many times he asked questions in response to questions that he was asked. And no wonder, because he as God was certainly in control of a conversation. And we're going to look at one passage today where Jesus was asked some questions and he came back with some questions. And in that, as we take apart that text of Scripture, we will see some principles for communicating across a cultural divide. And when I say cultural divide, I really mean it not just in the sense of, say, North American culture versus, say, an Indian culture, although it includes that. I'm talking about culture in the sense of worldview. So it's really communicating across a worldview gap. So you might have someone who is exactly the same as you are culturally. Maybe grew up in Sault Ste. Marie all their life. But they might be thoroughly postmodern in their thinking. And therefore they are separated from you by a huge cultural gap. And so these principles apply across, so when I use the word culture, I mean it in that broad sense. So turn with me in your Bibles to Mark's Gospel, the 12th chapter, Mark chapter 12. It's near the end of Jesus' life, and he's actually, there are three groups of people that come and ask him questions, all in the context of the temple. For the background, he has just finished his very provocative symbolic act of cleansing the temple and driving out all the money changers. And there are three groups of people, and from Mark 11:27 all the way to Mark 12:27, we find these three questions that people ask him. First of all, the chief priests and the teachers of the law in verse 27 of chapter 11 said, verse 28, "By what authority are you doing these things, and who gave you authority to do this?" Referring, of course, to the cleansing of the temple. That was one question. Then, in verse 13 of chapter 12, we find another set of questions. Later they sent some of the Pharisees and the Herodians, who were a kind of a political party there, to catch Jesus in his words. They said, "Teacher, we know you're a man of integrity, blah, blah, blah." And then they say, "Is it right to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Should we pay or shouldn't we?" That was the second question that was asked. And then in verse 18 of that chapter, we find this time not so much a question of authority, which is from a religious group, not so much a question of a politically motivated question, but this time it was more of an intellectual question. You see, the Sadducees were a group that didn't believe in the resurrection. And so they drew upon an Old Testament prescription that if a man died without having any children, it was the duty of his husband, or his brother, to marry that woman, and the first child would belong to, in name, to the husband. And it was called the levirate marriages. And so they used this to cook up a very complicated question that the same woman was married 7 times, and because each husband kept dying, and so they said, well, which one is she going to belong to in heaven? That was a question they came up with. So there was a intellectual question, there was a politically motivated question, and there was a religiously motivated question as well. Now, the first principle is so obvious here that we actually miss it altogether. And that is the fact that Jesus knew instantly where these questions were coming from. In the case of the chief priests and the Pharisees, throughout the scriptures we are told that Jesus was aware of the fact that they were motivated by envy and jealousy because all the crowds were following Jesus. In the case of the Herodians and the Pharisees, it says in verse 15, "But Jesus knew their hypocrisy." He knew they were looking to trap him in some way. And as for the Sadducees, he knew that they didn't believe in the resurrection. So Jesus was very thoroughly aware of the background of the people so that he knew what was the milieu from which the question was coming. All too often we are too quick to answer questions without understanding the question in the first place. The principle here, I'm going to give you 4 words to basically write down so that you can anchor these 4 principles in your mind. Those words are not original with me. I learned them many, many years ago from Os Guinness. But fitting them into this text was something that I've developed over the years. The first principle is simply identification. We need to know where people are coming from in order to understand a question. I mean, if someone were to call this church at 5:30 this evening and say, hey, I hear there's a seminar going on, I'd like to get there. How do I get to your church? What's the first question you're going to ask them? Right, would you give directions before finding out where they're coming from? No, it's elementary. If someone wants to know how to get there, you have to first find out where they're coming from. In exactly the same way, when you get a question, you have to first understand where that question is coming from. And for that, you simply need to know where they are at. You see, everybody has a worldview. Everyone has a philosophy. Even those who believe even someone who makes a statement like, I don't believe it's necessary to have any philosophy at all. That's a philosophy. It's simply a way of looking at reality. It's a way of looking at the world around you. And one of the ways people have looking at the world around you is we don't need to have a way of looking at the world around us. So everybody has a philosophy. Everybody has a way of life. And so the identification stage is extremely important for you to simply find out what their worldview is. How do you do that? Let me give you some suggestions. Life experiences, people's life experiences often have either shaped or revealed their philosophy. So a lot of everyday events that happen provide fodder for conversation to find out what their philosophies are. So I mean, when something like a September 9/11 happens, it's a great opportunity to talk to people. Well, what do you think about it? What do you think? Every night Larry King wanted to answer the question, where was God? Well, it's good for us to find out. What do you think about these things? How was God involved in this stuff? Don't give them any answers. Just find out how they even think. Or when famine, all these world disasters, or the stock market going up and down mostly all this time, how do people respond to this? What do you think about this? What do you think about things? And something else may come up in the newspaper. Right now, of course, we've got all this news about the sniper in Maryland, and they were asking people, how do you advise your children, if they're afraid? Well, that's a great opportunity to talk to someone and say, what do you think? How would you answer that question? All of these everyday events that come up all the time are a wonderful opportunity when you talk to people to find out how they think about these things. That gives you some clue as to where they're from, and all the time you're busy identifying yourself with them. And if you want to have a broad framework to look at the kinds of areas that you can ask, there are really only 5 basic questions that make up any worldview or philosophy. The first one is the question of creation or existence. Why is something here as opposed to nothing? That's a basic question every philosophy has to answer. The fancy word for it is metaphysics. The second question is the problem of suffering in this world, suffering and evil. How come there's so much suffering in this world? People have some notion about that. And when you dialogue with them on that, you're going to get some idea of how they think about such things. The third question is, how do you get out of this mess? What got us into this mess? What is the cause for this? How do you get out of it? That's the question of salvation. And different people have different ideas. And so it's good to find out where they're from. The fourth question is the question of destiny. What happens after you die? And then the fifth and final question is, how do you know the first 4 answers are true? So those are the 5 basic questions that every philosophy is made out of, whether it's a systematically thought through philosophy or just a gut feel philosophy that people have. Why is something here as opposed to nothing? How did we get into this mess? How are we going to get out of this mess? What's going to happen after you die? And how do you know these answers are true? Everybody needs to grapple with those answers. So just ask them those questions, and gives you some idea of how the people are thinking. And that first stage is simply identification. I remember a guy at Atomic Energy of Canada I was working with. He had a PhD in aeronautics from Princeton University. Well, I just made the assumption the guy was a real analytical, logical guy. And he was at work. And in my attempts to communicate the gospel to him, we talk a lot about what is classically known as apologetics. Giving all the evidences for the Christian faith. Never got to first base with the guy. Well, near the end of our acquaintanceship, he was leaving Atomic Energy. He was going to work in another company. And so in the last week that he was there, it was a nice sunny day outside. So I said, hey, Ron, let's go out and have lunch together. And so we sat outside on a little grassy knoll out there. And all of a sudden, he shocked me when he said, you know what? He said, it's very hard for me to believe that God exists inside all those dingy churches all over the place, he said. But when I'm sitting outside here and there's this wonderful sunshine, he said, it's a lot easier for me. You know, with a sinking feeling in my stomach, I realized that this guy, while he may be a PhD in aeronautics from Princeton University, he does not approach religious issues analytically. He approaches them primarily emotionally. If I had known that a long time ago, all it would have taken was a few questions along these lines. I would not have wasted so much time. At least I'd have spent a lot more effort dealing with the emotional side of life with him. And you see, it was a mistake that I made. I didn't know where he was coming from. I was giving him answers on how to get to church, never asked him where he was coming from. No wonder he didn't end up there, you know. And I don't know what happened to him after that, but I've never forgotten that story. And so, your first step in communicating across the worldview gap, you're going to have to befriend people, spend time with them, and just ask a whole lot of general questions, you know. But remember you got this little framework in your mind, you know, and it doesn't hurt if you don't have a good memory to even have a little notebook on each of these contacts, you know. This is what they believe about why we got here, why we got into this mess, how we got out of this mess, where are we heading up, and how do they believe the answers are true. You'll see later on why this identification stage is so important. Okay, well, once that identification stage is important, you might say, well, okay, I guess now we're ready to give answers. No, not yet. Jesus knew where they were coming from, but he still didn't give answers. He came back with a question in each case. Let's look at the questions. The first question, go back to verse 29 of chapter 11. When they said, by what authority do you do this? Jesus said, I will ask you one question. Answer me and I will tell you by what authority I'm doing these things. John's baptism, was it from heaven or from men? Tell me. Now notice the effect the question had. They immediately went into a huddle. Obviously they were not expecting this. Whatever else they were expecting, they were not expecting this question. I mean, what earthly relationship did John's baptism have to do with why you cleaned up the temple the way you did? But they went into a huddle, and of course they were trapped. They said, we can't say yes, we can't say no. As far as the Herodians and the Pharisees were concerned, who asked about taxes, it says in verse 15, should we pay or shouldn't we? But Jesus knew their hypocrisy. Why are you trying to trap me? He said, bring me a denarius and look at it. They brought the coin, and he asked them, whose portrait is this and whose inscription? Because Caesar's image was stamped on one side of the coin. Well, again, they weren't expecting any question like that. What was happening? See, the effect in each case was to ask the questioner. The questioner suddenly begins to say, I never thought of it that way before. This is the second stage. If the first stage is identification, the second stage is still more questions. But this time they are carefully chosen questions that get the person to the point where they say, I never thought of it that way before. That's your goal. If the goal in identification is simply to find out where they're coming from, the goal in stimulation, which is the next phase, is by further questions, and we'll talk about it a little bit more, get them to say, I never thought of it that way before. Okay, how does that work? In order to do that, in order to understand what Jesus was doing, and it gives us a very workable model in our own lives, you have to understand how people normally acquire their philosophy. My brother-in-law, in his first book that he wrote, really developed a lot of fresh insight on this stuff. See, the first level at which a lot of people acquire their philosophy are the more philosophically minded. That's like taking a course in philosophy at university, or reading a book on how to think logically. That's a formal way in which people do, or they read about the philosophers and the studious book types. That's how they pick up their philosophy. The second level, which is a very pervasive level, is philosophy that comes through the back door of the media. And huge numbers of us pick up our philosophy that way. That's why the arts are so powerful. 25, 30 years ago, when I was a student at university, when existentialism was a huge, powerful force on the intellectual campuses, Some of the most powerful movies that were made by a producer by the name of Ingmar Bergman. And his movies, they were good, they won many awards. But the reason they were so dangerous was they basically systematically taught existentialism. God doesn't speak. Today, by the way, book authors of books, bestsellers. There was one author by the name of Ayn Rand. She wrote books like Fountainhead and places like that. Well, that was a systematic attempt to teach one of her theology, her fundamental philosophies, and people absorbed them. In my country, in India, a lot of people are illiterate. They never read their epics, the Ramayana, the Mahabharata. But when television became ubiquitous, they started running series where every Sunday for half an hour there would be one of the dramas from the two religious books would be shown. You know, it's amazing to see a city of 6 million people suddenly go empty on the streets at 11 o'clock. Everybody goes to their televisions. Because while people can't read, they can certainly understand acted out dialogue and drama and stuff like that. And through this, a whole philosophy begins to develop. Today, books like, Celestine Prophecy and Mary Ann Williamson's Course in Miracles and all these kind of things that people read and stuff like that. And just recently, browsing through the bookstore at the airport, I saw something else called a course, just kind of reading through the background. A lot of people take these courses. We have a little brochure in our little city called Nighttime Education or whatever, Continuing Education. Well, this course on sacred contracts was being advertised right there. All kinds of people are taking these courses. And then, of course, you have all the innumerable talk show hosts, Dr. Phil on Oprah Winfrey probably shapes a whole lot of people's philosophy without us being aware of that. And so, through many of these pundits, we acquired that's the second level. And then there's the third level, and that's called kitchen table philosophy. Where you just simply talk about life issues across the fence in the back or right at the table. 9/11 comes, millions of households are having conversations about it. What fathers say, what mothers say, what teachers say are all slowly building a philosophical worldview. And so people acquire these and can talk about philosophy at three levels. The formal level, the level of the arts and the media, through the imagination, not the intellect, and thirdly, what we might call a kitchen table or down-to-earth, everyday stuff philosophy. Now, why is it important for us to know that? It's important for us to know this because most questions that we get when we are dealing with communication across cultures, most questions come at level 3 because that's where the rubber meets the road. So you're talking to somebody and he says, well, why is abortion wrong? Oh, woman's body is her own. She can do what she wants with it. Or what do you mean my grandmother is going to hell? She was a good woman. But just because she didn't believe in your Jesus, she's going to hell? Well, that's level 3 question, right? That's right where the rubber meets the road. And what do most of us do? Answer the question right back at level 3. Yeah, that's what the Bible says. Your grandmother's going to hell. How much mileage do you think you're going to get with that kind of response? It's true, but it's not going to get you anywhere. That's why so many discussions like this generate more heat than light. And we get all worked up, and we get up into arguments. But notice what Jesus did. In every case, Jesus asked a question. This is the key to stimulation. Jesus asked a question. He got a question at level 3. He came back with a question that moved them away from level 3 up to level 1, which is at the level of truth. So they said, by what authority are you doing these things? And he could have answered right back at level 3, I am Jesus, the Son of the living God. He didn't say that. He said, oh, you want to ask me about authority? Why don't we discuss authority for a while? By what do you think of John the Baptist's authority? So you see, what he did was, by the question, he moved it away from a level 3 practical personal discussion, which is likely to get people upset, to a little bit more detached discussion about issues that were raised by the question. So let's talk about authority for a while. Same thing with the people at with the guys who asked him about the coin. Should we pay taxes? He could have said, yes, you should, or no, you shouldn't, and they would have trapped him. Instead, he moved from the question of whether I should pay taxes or not, which is a level 3 practical, down-to-earth, rubber meets the road issue, to a bit more of a truth question, which is, Guys, whose image is on here? You know what he was doing? The image, whose image you bore, that person had certain rights over you. That was a well-known principle. And so the bridge Jesus was going to use was that if Caesar's image is on that coin, then Caesar has certain rights. And then, of course, where he was going to lead them from there was, and by the way, you have been made in the image of God, and therefore that has certain rights. So he was just building a bridge. But he was moving it from level 3 back to the level 1 issue. And let me show you how that works in some of these examples that I gave you. So, for example, if someone says to me, and I have been asked that question, especially on campuses, which is, well, what do you mean? My grandmother is good. Let's use that one for example. Level 3 answer is, yes, she is going to hell without Christ. Won't get you anywhere. The level 1 question that comes back is, that's an interesting question that you're asking me. By the way, you used a very important word, good. Can we talk a little bit about how do you know what is good and what is not good? Now, at that point, the question can go many different directions. That person might say, what do you mean, what's good? Well, you just said your grandmother was good, so obviously you have some standards by which you determine what is good and what isn't good. See, we've gone completely away from the grandmother at this point, because that's the touchy point, right? That's the level 3 point. Now we're into a much more intellectual and much less emotional discussion on how do you know anything is good or bad. Now at that point, the conversation can go one way. She might say, or he might say, well, good, what's good? I guess good's all relative. Well, really, is good all relative? Well, if good is all relative, then how do you know that your definition of good is the same as God's definition of good? On the other hand, if they say, no, well, I guess I'm good because I'm a religious person. Well, that's good. Okay, what religion do you follow? Well, they might say, in this country, they might say, well, I kind of follow the Judeo-Christian ethic. Well, that's really good, so do I. So, what does that book tell you about goodness? Well, I guess it tells me I need to behave this way, behave that way, etc. Well, who told you that? Well, God did. Okay, so you do believe what God says. But then let's take a look at what God says about eternal issues as well. You see what happens, you've taken them completely away from the level 3 issues, back up to the level 1 issue. And now they're having to deal with, they're basically having to answer their own question, but at a slightly different level. And after a while, this will become second nature to you. You know, I remember one time when I was sharing this message in our own church, and the two guys were talking afterwards, and I overheard them. First guy turns to the second guy and says, boy, that was a good message. The first guy says, what do you mean by good? You know? So they were learning anyway. See, because when you do that, when you get them back, you'll enable them to see for themselves contradictions within their own system. When I was studying at MIT many years ago, I was part of a host family program there, and my host was a Jewish doctor. I spent some time with them, really got to know them well, and soon they discovered that I was a Christian, and we were talking, and then one day we were driving, they'd come to pick me up to go bowling, and so we were just having one of our conversations, and he said, wow, you know, Sundar, I don't really believe in all this stuff. Ultimately, just is whatever you're sincere about, that's all that matters. Now, I got to know him well enough at this point. This is why identification is important. I said, well, Buzz, I've got to ask you a question. Please don't misunderstand me. I said, Hitler was absolutely sincere when he exterminated 6 million Jews at Auschwitz. All of a sudden, he got upset. And his wife said to him, well, Buzz, you can't have it both ways, you know. So what that does is he was forced, that question forced him to apply his own theory to his own statements. That's when they begin to see. At level 3, they can argue with you till you're blue in the face. But a careful question that stimulates their thinking moves them back. And basically, what you're saying is, what getting them to say is, I didn't see it that way before. You made me think. They might not admit it to you, but you know, questions stick. People can get rid of answers. They can brush away your answers. Probably call you all kinds of names in their head in the process, you know. But they cannot brush away a question. Because questions have a way of getting past people's defenses, and they stick there because now they become their question. You see, we can shut down answers, but you can't shut off questions. You know that from our experience, right? And so it's very, very important for us to learn. And this basic mindset is they're coming at level 3, turn it to level 1 question. Same thing with the issue of abortion. Actually, I get the question mostly on the gay agenda on campuses. Well, what do you mean? Is homosexuality wrong? Well, I don't even get into a discussion on homosexuality, because that's hard. What I come back and say is, you used a good question. Do you believe anything is right or wrong? You asked me whether I believed homosexuality was wrong. I want to ask you another question. Do you believe anything is right or wrong? Let's forget about homosexuality. Now they can either going to have to say yes or they're going to have to say no. If they say no, right and wrong is all relative, then from there what I usually do in a conversation is, okay, in other words, it may be okay for you but not for me, right? Well, that's what they're going to say. Yes, and I say, well, then why are you so upset with me for saying it's wrong? It's just my viewpoint. You just said it was okay. They can't live with that. On the other hand, if they say, yeah, I do believe there are certain things that are right or wrong, then you can at least say, okay, how do you determine what things are right and what things are wrong? Is it totally relative? Then you're back to the first option. If it's not relative, in other words, you believe there are absolute standards of right and wrong, because that's the only other option to relative. And if they say yes, then you say, okay, where do you go for your absolute standards? And so now you're off and running, you're far away from that emotion-laden initial question to begin to ask stimulation. There's a time later on we'll have to come back to those. This is not a technique for avoiding the difficult issues, but it is saying don't get there too quickly. You don't know where they're coming from and you haven't made them think differently. These are absolutely critical steps if we're going to get past those cultural barriers. You tracking with me so far on the first two questions? Identification first, stimulation is to get them to say. Then now, once you get past that stage, then the next stage is called translation. Identification is just getting to know where they're coming from. Stimulation is making them say, oh, I never thought of it that way before. Translation is my message in their language. Look what Jesus does with them. After he asks them the question, they kind of go into their huddle, and they say in verse 31 of chapter 11, if we say John's baptism was from heaven, he's going to say, then why didn't you believe in him? If we say from men, then they feared the people, for everyone held that John really was a prophet. So they answered Jesus, we don't know. And then Jesus said, I'm not going to tell you either. But then he does tell them. Notice he goes on. He then began to speak to them in parables. And he gives them the famous vineyard parable. Now those things are all drawn from the people's background. This is a story now. It's a story that they know. Isaiah chapter 5, remember where God talks about Israel being a vineyard and what more could I have done for my vineyard. And so the people that he was talking to fully understood the story. And then of course, as he goes on to talk about the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. That's a quotation from Psalm 118. They know that well. By now, these people clearly understand. Look what it says here, verse 12. Then they looked for a way to arrest him because they knew he had spoken the parable against them. All he did was just simply tell them some stories, and now they began to understand for themselves. This is translation, my message, but in your language. Notice what Jesus was doing. They asked a question at level 3. He took them back to level 1, talked about authority for a while, got them all confused because they said, I never thought of it that way before. Then he illustrates back at level 2 with a story. And then he finally applies back at level 3. Finally he does say, you guys have rejected me. And then they get the point of the message far more effectively than if he had answered the original question straight up. That's why this is important to understand these 3 levels. The questions will come at level 3, our everyday level. Our job is to ask questions to move them back to level 1, and the better job you do at the identification stage, the better job you'll be able to do at the stimulation stage. Once you got them thinking about the issue in a different way, then level 2, which is the arts and the media, and that's why it's important for us to remain connected. And I don't mean being undiscerningly immersed in all the garbage that our culture produces. But we need to have some kind of understanding of what's going on around us. Let me tell you this story. Charles Colson, in one of his books, he tells about, let me see if I can find that here. Colson talks about having dinner with a media personality and trying to talk to him about Christianity. Colson told him how he came to Christ. Well, obviously Jesus worked for you, his friend replied, but went on to tell him about some friend of his who had been turned on by New Age spirituality. Crystals, channeling, just like your Jesus. Colson then tried to explain the difference but got nowhere. He raised the issue of death and the afterlife, but his friend did not believe in heaven or hell and was not particularly bothered by the prospect of dying. Colson explained what the Bible said, but his friend did not believe in the Bible and any other spiritual authority. See, a lot of this stuff was going on at level 3. Nothing was happening. Finally, Colson mentioned a Woody Allen movie, Crimes and Misdemeanors, about a killer who silences his conscience by concluding that life is nothing more than the survival of the fittest. All of a sudden, his friend became very thoughtful. Colson then followed with examples from Tolstoy and C.S. Lewis on the reality of the moral law. The friend was following him. Then Colson cited the Epistle of Romans on human inability to keep the law. His friend by this time was paying close attention to the message of Christ's atoning work on the cross. See what happened? He took him from level 3 to this time through the movie, which was his bridge point. That not only raised questions by silencing him, he then went to Tolstoy and C.S. Lewis. Basically, that's level 2, literature in this case. That's where the arts are so important for us, because imagination is such a powerful tool. Christians have by and large abandoned that whole area, and then we are lamenting how the devil has taken over that whole area. But various kinds of art forms and things like that, if we are familiar with that, then it becomes possible for there's a common ground through which we can illustrate at level 2, and then we can come back with the because he finally got to Romans. He finally got to Romans, but he couldn't get a hearing for it in the beginning until he got to level 1, which was to stimulate him enough to get him quiet, and then through the level 2, which was the arts, which were common ground once again, got him to see my message in your language, the inability of humans to keep the law, and then specifically the remedy, which is Christ and the gospel. Here are some principles to keep in mind when we get that far. When we are finally communicating our message in their language, try to avoid jargon, because when you do get to that point, our normal Christian language is insufficient. By the way, this is what I think made C.S. Lewis such a genius. If there was any one author that helped me to learn how to explain Christian doctrine in language that non-Christians understand, he was a master at that. And so, none of us are self-made people. All of this I learned because of the wisdom of other people. And so as we get to read, especially Lewis in particular, and others like that, keep your ears and eyes open and say, okay, how can I explain this truth that I use everyday language but which they won't understand at all? Jargon can often create, not only not communicate, it can communicate the wrong image. When I worked for Atomic Energy of Canada, one of the big issues was how do you transport radioactive used fuel? And the containers that we designed for that, this is long ago so I can't remember the details, but they're first kind of liquefied and embedded into liquefied glass, much the way you put color into a color ashtray, silicone and whatnot is melted and the radioactive stuff is put into that. Then it is encased in thick concrete cylinders, and then it is covered by a steel cylinder that has got to survive all kinds of tests, like being thrown against concrete walls at 60 miles an hour and whatnot. Do you know what the in-house jargon term is for that? Flask. Now imagine if you said to someone who wanted to know how safe transportation, he said, don't worry, we put it safely into a flask. And that poor person had a 10th grade chemistry lab experiment where they dropped a flask on the floor. You see what the jargon does in that case? Not only does it not communicate the right picture, it communicates the totally wrong picture. And so we have to be very, very careful about using in-house jargon when you communicate, so avoid jargon. Secondly, always remember, even the most militant non-Christian is an image bearer. They bear the image of God in themselves. And deep within them there are longings for significance. And that's another common ground. You don't need all of this all of the time, but you just need to remember this. Thirdly, they may react to the concept of sin, but they all understand the concept of alienation. We live in a society where people are alienated. But if you look at Genesis chapter 3 and what happened, the consequences of Adam and Eve's rebellion, they are described in 5 classical forms of alienation. And we'll look at that a lot more on Wednesday night. But I can very quickly mention it to you right now. First of all, there's internal alienation. They covered up themselves. They couldn't stand anymore who they were. They had to cover up themselves from each other. There was alienation from God. There was alienation from one another. There was alienation from nature. And there was internal physical disintegration as well. We live in a society that understands alienation very well. And often that can be a much better starting point for a conversation. And then tie it back to what the Bible calls sin. And then pain. Pain is a wide open door for the communication of the gospel. You know why? Because apart from the gospel of Jesus Christ and his death on the cross, a lot of people are very good at diagnosing pain. They cannot answer one question, though they cannot give it meaning. Only Jesus brings meaning to suffering, because at the heart of our gospel is redemption through suffering. And therefore the concept that suffering can be redemptive is unique in Judeo-Christian thinking and nowhere else. And so those are some, and of course, by the way, many intellectual questions are really rooted in personal pain. Somewhere they've been hurt. They're upset with the church today. It's not just because they are militant atheists. They probably had a bad experience sometime, or they know someone who's had a bad experience. So those are some things to keep in mind when it comes to translating the message, our message in their language. So identification, stimulation, translation, and then finally, the last stage is what I call justification. Because at some point, as you start giving your message in their language, they might come back to you and say, well, how do you know it's all true? Well, okay, I understand what you're saying about Christ and cross and stuff like that. But for just a book that was written. Just last week I was talking to a young man in our church, and he just started attending our church. He said, well, my biggest obstacle, he said, how can a book that was written a few thousand years ago by human beings possibly help me in my search for God today? In other words, so he's asking me, how can it be true? Now that's the stage at which the normal apologetics comes in. You know, the kind of answers to tough questions type of books. You know. That's not the place to start. But once you've done your identification, once you've done your stimulation, once you've done the translation, then when they come back, then we can give some reasons. And in Jesus' case, the scripture was the common ground in every case. And so they didn't need any more. When you live in a society where people already accept the scriptures, then how do you know it's true? All you need to do is say, well, let me show you the Bible. So two people who believe in the authority of the scriptures are talking. When one person says, how do you know that's true? It's simple. You just go to the Bible. But if someone isn't believing that, then of course you've got to go a little back further. In Jesus' case, in every case, it was just the scriptures. But today we need to have some answers to those 5 questions. Remember those 5 key questions that formulate every philosophy? Why is something here as opposed to nothing? So we need to have some rudimentary understanding at least of what, how do you answer the issues of creation and all that kind of stuff. Secondly, sin and suffering, and those are some of the topics we're going to be looking at during this week. Why is there evil in this world? Why is there so much evil and suffering in this world? And boy, every time there's one of these national disasters, I know Larry King always has some religious person out there, and every time I cringe because we get such pathetically inadequate answers to these questions. Most of them like, well, you know, God was kind of sitting back there helplessly, he really can't do anything about it. It's really not God's fault at all, you know. They're all busy desperately trying to defend God and paint a picture of him that is woefully inadequate, you know. But we need to have some kind of an answer to that question. And then the thirdly was, how do you get out of this mess? And then fourthly, what happens after we die? And then finally, how do you know it's all true? And so there is a place for those kinds of things. And not all of us will be equally skilled. Remember that, precisely because pain and stuff like that are such an important part of where people are coming from. And if you've done a good job with identification, like my friend at Atomic Energy of Canada, you may never need to get to this stage at all. They may be ready and open for you to just pray with them and lead them to Christ. But when you do run into those people, then you know what? You also don't have to do everything. I've given you these 4 stages. That doesn't mean every one of us is going to be equally skilled at all 4 stages. I have a friend of mine who's a great evangelist. He's a relational evangelist, but he just has no time for apologetics. He doesn't have a mind for that at all. But he's very, very good at identification with people. He makes friends with non-Christians all the time. And then all of a sudden he'll get to a certain point and say, well, look, I need to call my friend. Now I'll get a call from him. He'll say, hey, Sundar, I got this guy, you know. I'm not very good at the identification stage. You know, I mean, not that I don't know how to do it. So much of my life as a pastor is spent with Christians. I don't have enough contact with non-Christians. But he does. We work together as a team. So it's not just that one person has to do all of this. This is just to help us think about ways in which to get across, communicate across cultures. Now, does this mean that you are going to be guaranteed success? No. In all 3 cases with Jesus, he failed. If success means persuading the other person to accept the gospel, then Jesus failed in all 3 cases. The chief priests and the Pharisees decided we got to go find a way to kill this guy. The Herodians cooperated totally in that whole process, and the Sadducees remained Sadducees. They didn't suddenly believe in the resurrection because of it. So this is not a gimmick or a foolproof technique or method. These are just some fundamental principles of communicating effectively across culture, which maximizes the likelihood of clarity in communication and understanding. Ultimately, it is still the Holy Spirit. Remember that song we sang? I don't know the ways of the Spirit. Oh, I don't know how God does it. But I know whom I believe. I don't know the ways of the Spirit. That is true. We don't know. There's some amazing things. You'll be 1/3 of the way into this process, and all of a sudden the person's ready to receive Christ. So just remember, you're just into the process. God can't be put in a box. But that doesn't mean we can't learn from Jesus. And it's just very interesting to me that in one place in Scripture we have all these 4 steps so beautifully and powerfully modeled for us. Now, I told you already about the fact that most of us find stories more effective than in driving us. Sometimes this thing what I have said today might give you an idea that, boy, you need lots of time for this. Yes, you do. Because people are primarily relational, and especially in these societies, relational evangelism is absolutely critical. However, to show you how effective these principles are even in relatively brief conversations, let me read for you this extract of a story from Rebecca Pippett's book, Out of the Salt Shaker. This is a conversation that took place on a bus journey, on a Greyhound bus journey, but you'll notice the 4 stages of identification, stimulation, translation, and justification. So this is how a real life thing works out. This is Pippert speaking. I was sitting next to a beautiful black law student on a bus to Salem, Oregon. We were discussing our heroes when she told me Karl Marx was a hero. When I asked why, the first question, look, identification. Just want to find out why Karl Marx is your hero. I said, she said, because of his passionate regard for the oppressed. I agree with that concern, I responded, but what is Marx's view of the universe? For example, I know he holds no belief in God. She's still continuing identification. Oh yes, she replied, Marx is very intelligent. He sees the universe as godless, and we have meaning only in a corporate sense of class. We're not significant as individuals. Yet you admire his regard for the oppressed, even though they are ultimately insignificant. It seems strange, doesn't it, to value them so highly when they are random products of a universe? Why not manipulate them as you please? Now she's into stimulation. Oh, I couldn't do that. I guess if my natural response is to feel people are significant, then I need a philosophic system that says the same thing, she observed. But I believe we are basically good. If we could live in a classless society like Marx said, we would be free of the things that weigh us down. I really think on the basis of economic determinism we will be safe. Do you really believe if we lived in the ideal Marxist world, our problems would be voted out? She's back to identification again. Absolutely. I took a deep breath and said, now she's going for stimulation, really for the jugular now. Listen, I know a guy. He is one of the worst racists I've ever met. She's talking to a black girl now. If he lived with you for 50 years in your classless society, every time he saw you, he'd still think of you as a nigger. How can Marx wipe out the ugliness and hatred of a bigot? She turned away from me, her eyes glaring and looking out of the window, and she said, right on. We've been trying to change that for centuries, and all of the rules and laws in the world can't change you. The laws curb behavior. They can force you to treat me justly, but they cannot make you love me. See, she had struck home. I knew I had struck a raw nerve, but I felt I had to. Anyone who has suffered as blacks have in this society must know that an external change does not mean an internal change. So I said, you tell me that you know people are significant, and you need a system that says so. Now you're saying that the real evil comes from within us. See, she's picking up the common points now. For external rules or laws can curb but not transform behavior. So you really need a system that regards evil as internal, and a solution that transforms radically, not superficially, right? That's stimulation again. Yes, she said, but it'll take a lot more than a human attempt to change us, but we need it. I couldn't agree with you more. In fact, that's the very kind of system I have found, she said. Now she's into translation, my message in your language. Really? What revolution are you into? When I told her I followed Jesus, I think I'd better not quote her exact words of response. But after she recovered from her shock, she asked me how I knew it was true. Now it's time for justification. I mean, this was a script written for this stuff. She listened intently, and when we arrived, she said, I'd like to get together again. And there's something you're not going to believe. When I went home this weekend, my younger sister came to see me off. She told me she'd become a Christian. I told her she was anti-intellectual and unsubstantiated. In a furor, I packed my bags, walked out saying I never wanted to discuss it again, got onto the bus and sat down next to you. You know, we indeed worship a hound of heaven. So the overarching above all of this stuff is the Holy Spirit of God, who's correcting all our mistakes, correcting all our flaws, jumping hoops where we forgot them all. So remember, these are all not gimmicks so that we suddenly become more confident in ourselves. We're just better equipped to serve our Master with a heart that says, okay, use me in any way to communicate the gospel. I will do you justice, God, by learning all these things, but we worship and serve a hound of heaven who's already preparing these people that you're going for as well. Okay, let's pray together. Lord, unless you give us a heart for your glory that is manifest in changing people's lives and bringing them to yourself, all of these things are only going to make us even more accountable. I pray, therefore, that even as you give us these insights that give some kind of structure to our thinking and how to communicate with people who believe very differently than us, may we never forget, O God, to do all of that in total and complete dependence on you. Give us, first of all and continuously, a heart that longs to see your glory, that longs to see your power, and may we put ourselves in positions, in situations, in conversations where we can see you at work. Through us, limited though our ability is. Thank you that when we offer up to you that which is limited, but which is the best we can give to you, that you complete it in a way that just continuously amazes us. I pray, therefore, that you will take the things that these sons and daughters of yours have heard today. Will you then water them? Will you protect them? Will you amplify them? Will you augment them? Will you build them? Will you then allow them to use it in a way that is totally consistent with who you have made them to be, so that they just naturally will have this joyful experience, Father, of being able to communicate to people that they thought was so completely different than them. Thank you, Holy Spirit of God, that you are able to take seed and then water it, and you're the only one who can cause growth to happen. We trust you, therefore, in Jesus' name.